So it's all to play for still.
I think so. Do you want to bet against us?
I'm delighted today. It's something a bit different. We've got the wonderful Richard Sydenham here here to chat to us today about a great book, and it's a book that's been out since the 7th of October. It's called Nobody Remembers Second. It's a book which catalogues Aston Villa's, I suppose you could call them those heady days between 1989 and 1993, where Villa came so close to reaching the summit of English football again. But Richard, absolutely delighted to have you here, and really interested to talk to you about a couple of really cool things in this book.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to come on. Yeah, it's an interesting period because ultimately it wasn't really successful. I wrote, a lot of fans will be aware, I wrote another book called Ticket to the Moon that catalogued the era when we won the league and the European Cup and the years building up to that and then the years after that. And people used to say, "Oh, you're going to write a sequel?" And I'd kind of laugh it off. And I thought, no, it takes that much work. I'm not in a hurry to write another one. But after about 5 years down the line, I started to think, well, if there was a sequel, I think it would probably be, and it ended up being Nobody Remembers Second, because I thought it's a fascinating period, really, when you think of it, that we came second under Graham Taylor in 89-90, then second again under Big Ron in 92-93, but in between got relegated a couple of times. So it was a real period of extremes, and I think for me it felt like a legacy book, because I'm still around the West Midlands now, and that 1982 squad that won the European Cup are still right up there because they won the league, the last Villa team to win the league, won the European Cup. But I thought if one of those teams under Graham Taylor and Big Ron had just got over the line, I think that 82 team's legacy would be diluted somewhat, because another team will have at least won the league, if not the European Cup. But obviously it wasn't to be, and I thought it was still a great story worth telling, that why didn't we get over the line those 2 years? Obviously the Venglos period in between. So there's plenty to talk about.
Absolutely, for sure. And what I love about this book as well, and when people go and buy it, you'll see it as well, is there's a lot of frankness about this. The foreword is done by Dwight York and it's done by Nigel Spink as well. And I love the dichotomy of the two of those players. One who was in his prime, reaching the twilight of his career. I'm sure Nigel Spink won't mind me saying that at that period of time he had been on the 82 team. And then you have Dwight York, who was a teenager and was coming from the Caribbean over to the UK and seeing probably the different sides of things, because one or two things that Dwight York talks about in this, and we'll get onto it in a moment, is about, I suppose, the culture shock that Venglos brought and got himself when he came into the club. But there's a lot of frankness within some of the comments that are given, and it hits you right between the eyes. I think in the very first quote from was with regards to Graham Taylor, speaking about how he had to have that frank conversation with Andy Gray, and which sparks off the rebuild, I suppose, at that period of time that Taylor wanted to bring in. And that's what I loved about reading this. But what was it difficult, I suppose, to source all that information, I suppose, and those first-hand accounts from that period of time?
Well, it's not easy, because so much happened between that sort of 4 or 5 year period. And I don't think I'm giving away any secrets. Every author will have their own method. But for me, when you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write it on that period, you can't just start here and end there. For me, you have to kind of catalogue all those. Basically, you have to get a skeleton on the page, which is your chapter headings. Roughly, they change. They always change over time. But you think about where you're going to take it, and then the interviews come along, and you're adding flesh to the skeleton. But I think initially you need that skeleton. So I knew I couldn't just start with the runner-up season under Graham Taylor, because, like you've just intimated, his story started 2 years before that. You know, when he took on Villa in such a bad way, when after they'd been relegated, he had to get us promoted again first. Then he got the promotion. I didn't want to spend too long on that because my book wasn't really about the promotion and everything, but I felt it was important just to point out the job that Graham Taylor had done to get Villa to the point of almost winning the league, the top flight over Liverpool, which obviously never happened. But to get to that position first, he had to rebuild the squad and get them promoted, and he did that. And before that, even we had to stay up the league the season before, and we just about managed that. And so, like you said about Andy Gray, yes, he got rid of Andy Gray. He wasn't very happy. He thought he could have been a good senior player in the dressing room, but at least Graham Taylor was straight with him and told him, you're on your way. I think players always appreciate honesty. So that's how it started. It was a big job that Graham Taylor did before he got into a position to have a go at winning the league.
Mm-hmm. And it moves on from there, obviously, because it's between 1989 and 1993, and there's some really good stories in there, but there's also these little nuggets in there. As people will know, Paul McGrath is one of my favorite players. He's my favorite player of all time. You'll see, hence the name of the podcast, and we had a good chat about him before doing this interview here. But there was a really good quote as it goes through here, and there's quite a lot about Paul McGrath. So if anybody is a huge Paul McGrath fan like me, you get to see the reverence that he's shown and that he's been given, even from the likes of Derek Mountfield. A comment that really got me as well was Martin Keown said that if he had known who was coming in, who Graham Taylor was bringing in, he wouldn't have moved to Everton at that time, and that actually left me a small bit dewy-eyed, I think is how I put it, because look, much not of what people might think of Martin Keown, he went on to be a fantastic defender, and I would have loved to have seen the two of those together. Did you interview Martin for this book himself, or were there comments that you'd found?
Many times and couldn't get hold of him because he's writing his own book, but he gave me that in a previous interview, so that's why I used that quote, because I thought it was very pertinent. But it was quite ironic, wasn't it, that he moved to Everton in '89 and then Villa beat Everton 6-2 with Martin Keown in the team in that up season. So that was probably a moment where Keown maybe thought to himself, maybe this wasn't the greatest move for my career. But obviously players haven't got crystal balls. He wasn't to know. But But on the McGrath thing, he's the best player. I started going down as a kid, 1981, and I'm still going now, over 40 years later, and I haven't seen a better player than Paul McGrath. Every now and again, you go through a period where the same player is man of the match every week, and that 81-82 team, actually, that wasn't the case because they were such a great team. There was no one player. Yes, people like Gordon Cowans will probably get called the best player in the team, but he wasn't the best. He wasn't man of the match every week because they also had Gary Shaw, they had Dennis Moore, they had Peter Witt, Tony Morley. There was loads of people that chipped in with that team. But over the years, one or two do stand out. Paul McGrath was man of the match nearly every week when I went. And it was the case more recent years when Jack Grealish was there. He was man of the match nearly every week. Every now and again, we come across a player, I think, that was just so central to the team that they're in. Grealish, which is the reason why they got 100 million for him. And I think Paul McGrath was a huge part of this Villa team of the period that I write about, from 88, 89, sort of 93, 4 times. So Paul McGrath was, and what, not only the effect on Villa, actually, I mean, like I mentioned in the book, if I actually had to name my world 11 of all time, Paul McGrath gets in that, not just the greatest Villa 11. And Villa fans, and I'm a Villa fan, they might not like me saying it, but if he'd have had the form he showed at Villa at a Liverpool or a United who he left when there was, he would probably be up there with your Cannavaros and these Paolo Maldini kind of people. It's a shame that he's probably not looked on like that globally, but in terms of the Villa fans, he definitely is. And I'm just glad he had those 2 World Cups in 90 and 94 where he was able to at least match those global stars for a couple of World Cups. and I was able to see why Villa fans hold him in such high esteem.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your book, there's pages and pages of dripping praise for him, which is brilliant, as I mentioned, from Derek Mountfield on. And there was one very good quote that when you guys get the book and you read it, you'll see it in greater context. That McGrath, there was about 3 minutes left in a game. McGrath went down, and Graham Taylor pulled Jim Walker over. Graham Taylor assembled an absolute who's who of a team around him. Then actually, like say Bobby Downs, Jim Walker, and all those guys that he brought with him. But he brought Jim Walker to one side and he said, "I want you to go in there. I don't want you to do anything to him. I just wanted you to tell him to stand up." That's all. Like, that's how much he meant. The Colossus had fallen. They needed to win this game, and Taylor was like, "I don't care. Just tell him just to stand up." It was like the king can't be down, you know.
Yeah, that's where my journalism background comes in, because while he's my favourite Villa player of all time, Paul McGrath, I'm not just going to say he's great, because we all know he had a lot of vulnerabilities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That you've just told was because he had a bender the night before and was probably still drunk at the time he was playing. Unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of him for the book, but I used a lot of reference in his own autobiography, and he was very honest and vivid in what he went through. And I think that particular time was the early part of his Villa career. Was basically, it was like a light bulb moment where he knew things had to change. And I think he recognised that Graham Taylor had made a great investment in him, because Manchester United wanted him to retire. They were saying, "Your knees are gone and we think you should retire." Yet Graham Taylor was coming in, put 400 grand on the table and saying, "No, actually, you're going to be the talisman to my new Aston Villa team." So he was getting one story from United and much more positive message from Villa. So when he went into Villa, I think it's fair to say it was a bit of a mess in terms of, the private side of his life. He knew that had to change. He worked very hard on turning his life around. And while he obviously was never, cured, as you could say, whatever alcoholics, whatever it would be, I think he knew he had a massive payback for Graham Taylor, and he definitely did that. And that continued into the Atkinson era.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah. And that, look, as I say, the Atkinson era brought this iconic jersey behind, that brilliant jersey that everybody holds so favorably or so fondly. But it wasn't always great. I suppose before we move on to maybe the Venglos years, Taylor brought in another Irish player. Well, maybe it turned out in subsequent years that maybe he mightn't have actually been Irish, but Tony Cascarino joined Villa for £1 million, and that was seen to have been kind of the sliding doors moment that never really became the player that that Doug thought he was probably buying. And I think to this day probably unfairly gets kind of castigated as being the signing that never put us over the top. But maybe when you make those signings, they just don't work out for you. And that obviously sparked a rebuild as well, I think, itself in from that very transfer, obviously not being able to get over the line.
It was a fantastic interview actually that Tony Cascarino gave in the book. I'm very grateful to that. In fact, we were chatting the other day as well. But he actually said that he's even now he feels like his real frustration from his career. I mean, he had a great career in the end. He was fantastic in France and did great for the Republic of Ireland. And but he still feels frustrated that he never quite worked out at Villa. He never stopped trying, of course. He was a great trier. The one thing he was always grateful about, he said the Villa fans never turned on him. They always backed him and tried, were desperate for him to do well. And I said, why? Because as a Villa fan, when you see that Villa spend £1 million on a player, you get excited. I mean, in 1990, that was it, 1990 when we signed him. We wasn't spending those kind of fees in those days. So we were so excited that we'd spent that amount of money on a player. We were desperate for him to do well, and he did okay. It didn't do any better than okay, really. But it was awkward because Ian Olney was doing ever so well in the team. And I think when Tony came in, I don't want to say it upset the apple cart because he was a good teammate. I don't think he did that, but they just tinkered with the way they were playing a little bit, maybe went a little bit more direct than they were, hitting the big balls up to Tony Cascarino, and it just didn't work out, really. I don't think it's not fair to say Tony Cascarino was the reason Villa didn't win the league. It was just another factor. There was some terrible results that they had that season that should have been better. Certainly not Tony Cascarino's fault that they didn't win the league, but yes, it was a factor that didn't get over the line. But fantastic interview in the book, actually. I think, when Villa fans read the book, they'll appreciate his contribution there.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the a really good chapter to read for sure. And somebody else, I suppose, as we move on to the Jozef Venglos here, and I mentioned that Dwight York did the foreword for this. He speaks quite a lot about Jozef Venglos, which, to be honest with you, I didn't really expect would be the case when I first picked up the book, seeing he did the foreword. But he talks quite a lot about it, and the culture shock that Venglos has coming in. Like, prior to Venglos being appointed, I found out from this book that Jack Charlton was in the fray. Brilliant, obviously being Irish, we love he's Saint Jack to us, Joe Royal, all of them didn't give the go ahead for that. I knew about that one, but Venglos comes in. Another person actually that was linked with it was Beckenbauer. When you talk about World 11s, probably Beckenbauer and McGrath would have been a meeting of the minds for a defensive team meeting. There would have been that would have been amazing. But talk to me about Dwight York and his feelings towards Jozef Venglos there, because once again, Venglos often talked about as being a man before his time, or a person before his time, came into probably a drink culture within English football. I don't think that's unfair to say, and couldn't really come to terms with how to change that. Would that be fair?
Yeah, definitely. From Dwight York's point of view, you got to remember he came over as what was it, about 18-year-old, and he wasn't a drinker anyway, as you'd expect at that age. And not long after he came over, this father figure that was Graham Taylor, who was nurturing him at the club, left to take the England job. So Dwight was feeling quite not so much he was getting over homesickness, but he was still trying to come to terms with this great sort of cultural change that he had gone from Tobago in the Caribbean to Birmingham. And then Taylor's gone and this new manager comes in, and he was wondering what was going to happen. And while most of the players didn't enjoy the Venglos era for various reasons I'll expand on now, from York's point of view, it was a breath of fresh air, because he was talking about the importance of living your life in a professional way, match preparation, eating sensibly, not drinking alcohol, these kind of things. And for Dwight, who didn't drink anyway, he really took it all on board, and he felt that it was a massive part of his early development at Villa. And even Tony Daly said the same. I know Tony quite well, and even now he doesn't drink. He's never been a drinker. So the people that was more, in that sort of professional mindset, in terms of not needing to have a beer after a game or the night before or whatever, they really took on board the Venglos way. But when you talk about the senior players who enjoyed a night out with the boys and enjoyed a few pints, they really couldn't get on with Venglos and his methods. But it wasn't just the drinking aspect and the eating sensible aspect. It was his communication apparently wasn't great. His grasp of English wasn't good. And he just couldn't get over to the team the way he wanted Aston Villa to play. I think in hindsight, he would have admitted that he should have brought a couple of his own men over who spoke his language, but also spoke good English, where they could have conveyed his message. I mean, he wasn't exactly a joker. He'd taken Czechoslovakia to the quarterfinal World Cup in 1990. The bloke knew the game. He knew football. But in terms of becoming a success in England at that time, it just didn't work. And communication and messaging his ways to these players, it didn't happen, and it was a massive failure. I think bringing Peter With on board looked a good move initially, an old Holt End hero, but Peter felt that Jozef Venglos didn't really want to manage the team. He thought he was more of a coach. So Peter took on the role as a manager. Lots of players felt that Peter was too aggressive and locally gave out lots of rollickings, and there just wasn't a good spirit around at the time, which is why they almost got relegated. Things changed terribly for the worse after the Taylor era. But on the positive side, as you alluded, though, the professionalism was there, but it was only appreciated by a minority, and York and Daly would probably be the minority there.
Yeah, and as you say, the Venglos era was short and sweet, and for some, I suppose. But then we got in probably somebody you could nearly say is diametrically opposed to Dr. Venglos. He brought in Big Ron. Obviously, he had done it at Manchester United. Flashy guy, the tan, the gold watches, the not afraid to be the biggest aura in the room. And he comes in, and once again, I will say it once more, through the whole lot of these, it's rebuild time. I suppose really at Aston Villa for through his tenure with the club. He does have to go through rebuilds as well there, but that's not before 1992, and almost getting Aston Villa to the summit again there. Big Ron, look, everybody speaks has their own kind of, I suppose, memories of Big Ron and stuff, and this book does kind of explode with memories of Big Ron once he does come into the fold. Tell us some more about some of the people you spoke to about that.
Well, you mentioned Big Ron. He was the greatest contributor to the book. I've got a good relationship with Ron. Doesn't live that far from me, so we had a couple of nice lunches, and he's always very honest with his time. I think, the greatest thing he gave the club at that time was hope.
Yeah.
Andy Gray actually mentioned it in his interview that Villa, after we were whimpering along under Venglos, we nearly got relegated. We needed a lift. And Big Ron was probably the perfect personality to give us that lift. Like you mentioned, all these personality, quite an extravagant guy, very positive. But he'd also got that background, winning 2 FA Cups at Man United. So it was the optimism he brought to the club, and he showed it very quickly in terms of the magnitude of the players he started signing. I mean, Steve Staunton, Daly and Atkinson was doing well in Spain. He brought him over. Kevin Richardson, name, an underrated player, I would say. But he'd won 2 league championships at Everton and Arsenal. So it was bringing in winners. Steve Staunton had won things at Liverpool. Even not long after, good footballers like Gary Parker, Ray Houghton came a bit after. So these people like Staunton, Houghton, Atkinson, they were players that Villa fans didn't expect to get. Even Dean Saunders a year or so later. He just totally changed the ambition at the club from a team that was, muddling along under Venglos, with no disrespect intended on anyone, but signing people like Neil Cox and Gary Penrice and these guys, the level of ambition just changed hugely. And I think that was his greatest contribution, and which unfortunately should have been a league title win, but it never happened.
Yeah, never did. And once again, Aston Villa ended up bridesmaids. And look, you can kind of call those 2 losses of the league, or not winnings of the league, were kind of sliding doors moments, I think, in a lot of ways. Obviously, not pipping Liverpool to the post. Villa then, as you said, they went downhill from there for a period of time, and whereas Liverpool went from strength to strength. Same at Manchester United in '92. Man United, obviously under Fergie, Liverpool don't win or Aston Villa don't win the league that year. United go from strength to strength. We all know what Fergie did, and Villa then, we didn't kind of obviously had the fall off that they had after Taylor left. we were up and above there in the top four, but we were never really seriously challenging for the league again afterwards. And you can kind of those sliding doors moments, and it's why it's kind of pertinent, I think, that you named the book Nobody Remembers Second, because we remember it, but that's, you know, and it's kind of almost fuel to the fire why you keep following the club, is because it's going to happen someday when we won't be second, we will be first, and that's the beauty about fandom, I think, which is really cool. But Richard,
there's a few comments on social media, actually, not many, just one or two, saying, well, I remember we came second. It's a bit silly, really. Obviously we remember it, but
yeah,
you got the wider point was, yes, Villa fans remember it, but outside Villa fans, those teams have been forgotten now because we didn't get over the line, and it's a world. Like Andy Gray said at the front of the book, you know, first is first, second is nowhere. You know, it's harsh, but it's true. And it's very unfortunate. Obviously, we didn't mention there was a couple of major personnel changes between managers of Taylor and Big Ron. Obviously, Taylor took the England job, and just after Ron joined, David Platt went to Italy.
Yeah.
Huge loss. That the sale of David Platt for $5 million to Bari. I mean, he'd been a huge figure for Villa, but what it did give was quite a few £1 million for Ron then to go and reshape the squad, which, as we just mentioned, you know, quite a few players came in, so there was a lots of sort of good and bad elements connected to that period.
I think so, yeah, and obviously, we didn't even get to the David Platt part. You know, obviously, he wanted to go and pit himself against the best of the best in Italy at the time. You know, that's somebody else that, once again, the theme of that period was build and rebuild, and that's what allowed Big Ron to do that, for sure. It's a fascinating book. I know a lot of people would think they know about that time period. Obviously, I've heard. I was just telling you off camera. I was born in 1985, so at 4 years of age, unfortunately, I wasn't aware of a lot of what was going on in '89. But being a Villa fan since '92, during the Paul McGrath, when I first really got to see Paul McGrath and see his glory on the field, you know, it was great for me to go back and pick up those nuggets from this book. I think absolutely every Aston Villa fan is going to pick out something there that they did not know from this, and maybe come away with it with a different viewpoint on certain things as well. So I want to say really well done in this book. It's really good. I'm not an avid reader. I'm going to be really honest here, because if there's any of my friends are watching this, they will say, read a book, Neil, read a book. No, it didn't happen, but it did. I read this and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you know, it's on pitchpublishing.co.uk, but you can also get it on Amazon, you can get it on Waterstones, you can get it online. We will share a link to this in the description below. I think it's a really, really good book, a really good book to have. I think any Aston Villa fan is going to want this in their stocking at Christmas time as well. So even if it's for the candidness, I think, of some of the interviews that you get, like you said, like you said with Cascarino, with Dwight York, with Big Ron as well. So really well done, and a fascinating book, I must say, for sure.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I mean, just to conclude, like you said, it wasn't the most successful period in Villa's time. It could have been 2 titles in 4 years, but it wasn't. But I think it was a lot of people's favourite times for Villa.
Yeah,
a lot of fans loved the Graham Taylor era, and a lot of fans loved the Big Ron era. And I think I've just kind of binded all that up into a small moment in time in the club's history that was worth talking about. And hopefully the Villa fans will enjoy it. Early feedback's been very positive.
Excellent, and I'm sure they will. I'm sure every Aston Villa fan that opens this will go cover to cover and have a lot of nostalgia and a lot of fond memories of this as well. But thank you so much. As I say, that Richard's book is out since the 7th of October. You'll pretty much find it wherever you find books, and it's called Nobody Remembers Second, Aston Villa 1989 to 1993. Thank you so much again, Richard, for popping on, and also thank you everybody for watching and for listening to this. The link to buy the book is in the comments below. And we'll be back very, very soon with another podcast. But thanks a million, Richard, and thanks to you for watching. And all that's left to say is up the Villa.